All right, so this is week 2 and the first of, I think, 5 short video lectures. What I want to do for this first lecture is just give you a quick and dirty overview of Middle Eastern history from about the year 2000 down to the Roman takeover in the 1st century BC. What you're looking at here is a map of the Middle East. Off to your left, you've got Greece down here. This is the area where we'll really be concentrating on for just a little bit. And what I'd like to do is show you sort of a schematic that I made for a class a number of years ago. And it's not to scale, I'll just tell you that. And some of the early material is, we don't quite know the dates, but I'll just start off with this. So you've got something called the Age of Patriarchs, and this is probably around 2000 BC, 1850 BC. This is the time of Abraham, when it's thought that Abraham was coming out of the northern part of the Middle East and then moving down. The next bit on this scheme, we've got Moses, where he went to Egypt and then left Egypt and then conquered Judea, or the Holy Land. This is probably around 1200 BC, but again, we don't quite know the dates on this. The next part of Middle Eastern history, we'll only spend a minute or two on, the Age of Monarchies. This is the time period when the Jewish people ruled themselves. And in the beginning, you had one kingdom ruled by King Solomon. And he had a son, and after Solomon died, those who were in the kingdom, some of the people in the kingdom did not want to follow him. So the kingdom broke into two. You've got the northern part called Israel and the southern part called Judah. Now they ruled themselves until you get down to a number of kingdoms that begin to take over this area. One is the Assyrians, who took over this area in about 750 BC. You also have the Babylonians, or what really technically are the Neo-Babylonians, and they were taking over this area around 587 BC. Now, we do have some biblical texts that talk about this particular time period. If you're familiar with the Old Testament, there's a book called First Chronicles, and what I've done is I've given you here quite a bit of text, and what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and read through this text. And as you'll see, you've got a number of kings named from Assyria. You've got King Pul. I'm not going to try and pronounce this particular king's name. And then what it's really talking about is the invasion of these Israelite kingdoms and the taking away of people. So what they did was they took a number of people that are listed in this particular text, and they brought them back into Babylon. And if you read 1 Chronicles 6:15, you'll see that a king went into exile, and a number of people in Judah and Jerusalem went into exile, or forced into exile, by King Nebuchadnezzar, which is really King Nebuchadnezzar II. So if you want to stop this video, please do. You can also pick up a Bible and read these directly from the Bible. If you remember from the previous slide, I showed that the Assyrians took over and the Neo-Babylonians. After them, the Persians come in. Now, the Persians do something different. So what you have, and this story is described in another Old Testament book called Ezra. So Ezra 1:1, it talks about King Cyrus. So this is King Cyrus the Great, if you're familiar with this particular time period. According to the Jewish book Ezra, King Cyrus was doing things because of the Old Testament God. So what happened is that King Cyrus allows those Jewish people who were taken off into exile into Neo-Babylonia to go back home. And what he did was he allowed them to rebuild a temple that was destroyed earlier, and he allowed all of those people to go back home. So a Persian King Cyrus is really seen as a hero by the Jewish people. A few centuries after the time of Persia, you also have the takeover by Alexander the Great. And this map is probably pretty small on your screen, but Alexander gets to start here. in his kingdom of Macedonia, and he eventually goes through the area that we're interested in, the Near East. He goes all the way into Egypt, and then eventually takes over this entire area, which is pretty massive, of course, at this particular time. Now, when Alexander came in, what he ended up doing is leaving troops as he kept campaigning. So these troops were Greek and Macedonian, and what they ended up doing is having a fairly large influence on quite a few of the cultures that were taken over by the Greeks and the Macedonians. This culture is called Hellenism. So the Greeks called themselves the Hellenes. So there are a number of effects of Hellenism on Judaism and of course later in Christianity. And I've just given you a few of these effects here. One is the Septuagint. So this literally means the 70. This is the translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. So this is the Greek Old Testament. Another thing that really affected the writing, especially in the New Testament, was the way that the Greeks wrote their biography and the way that they kept track of their history, or the way that they viewed their history. You can definitely see a lot of Hellenistic influences in the New Testament book of Acts. You also have the Greek style of writing letters. This certainly affected Paul. If you're familiar with the New Testament, quite a few of the books in the New Testament are written by Paul, and he does his letter writing in a Greek style. Another thing that had a very large impact on both Judaism and early Christianity is something called rhetoric. So, and as I put up here, it's a method of argumentation, or really a way to influence people. So there were specific ways that you would start off a speech and so on, and this definitely affected the Jewish people and the early Christians. You also have groups that were directly affected by Hellenism. Some were affected positively, so they adopted Hellenism as part of their lifestyle. Others rejected it. One was a group of people at a site called Qumran, which I will talk about in just a second. Okay, so far we've looked at how Alexander the Great and Hellenism has affected early Judaism, or Judaism and early Christianity. The next part that I want to talk about is the sort of the leftovers of Alexander's kingdom. So he died in 332 BC, and what ultimately happened is that a number of his generals ended up setting up their own kingdoms. And Antiochus IV was one of these kings. Now, what happened during this period is that Hellenism had a fairly large impact, as I've described. You have some Jewish people who wanted to keep the ideas of Hellenism within their culture, and there's also others who wanted to get rid of it, who wanted to totally reject it. You've got really two political parties in Judea. These are the Hellenizers, the ones who want to keep Hellenization, and those who wanted to reject it and keep a priestly government. Now, what ended up happening is that you've got a man named Seleucus, and he was a general of Alexander. His family members kept control of Judea, and they're called the Seleucids. Now, these were the government in control. What they allowed the Jewish people to do is to elect their own, or to organize their own religion and practice it the way they wanted to, but the Seleucids would pick the head priest. Now, in 167 BC, you've got a Seleucid king named Antiochus IV, and sometimes called Epiphanes. He was very strict with the Jewish people, and in fact, he tried to set up a statue, or he did set up a statue of himself within the temple, and this caused a revolt. This very famous revolt is called the Maccabean Revolt. There is a 1st century AD Jewish man named Josephus, and he's a historian, and he ended up writing a book called Jewish Wars. And if you want to read about the Maccabean Revolt, you can certainly look up online the Jewish Wars. This is chapter 1, and then this is subchapter 34. So you can take a look at that. What ended up happening is that there were people from the Hasmonean or the Maccabean family, and they ended up revolting against their Seleucid ruler, or Antiochus IV. and then ended up kicking out the Seleucids and starting a new sort of Jewish kingdom. And what they ended up doing is rededicating the temple, the Jewish temple that Cyrus the Great allowed the Jewish people to rebuild. And this is the very famous holiday called Hanukkah. So Hanukkah is the rededication of the Second Temple. And here's just a little bit too from the Old Testament, from a book called Second Maccabees. And if you'd like to stop the video, or if you have your Bible in front of you, you can open it up, Second Maccabees 4:13 to 15, which talks about Hellenization and all of the problems that came along with that. So you can go ahead and stop the video anytime and then read through this. Now, the Maccabees ruled Israel for a while, but then you've got the rise of the Romans. And the Romans came in and took over this area and made it their own area in 63 BC when the Roman general Pompey conquered this area. What the Romans ended up doing is putting these client kings in the area to rule over their own people, but they had to be under the control, under the control of the Romans. The most famous one is King Herod. So he became king of this area, really installed by the Romans in 37 BC. Now, Herod is one of those people whose study has changed over time. So if you look at books even from like the 1980s and early 1990s and before, Herod is really seen as a bad guy. And it's partly because of all the statements that come out about him in the New Testament. But that view has been changing. It's now seen that he is a great builder. In many ways, he tried to protect the Jewish population from the Romans and so on. So I've got a couple slides here showing some of the things that he did. Now, what you're looking at here is Herod ended up adding on to this Second Temple. And as you can see here, this is a recreation. This is not what stands today. There's not very much standing of this particular building, but Herod ended up spending quite a bit of money rebuilding this temple. In fact, what's really left here is something called the Wailing Wall, and this is in Jerusalem. So it's this wall here. This was the base of the Second Temple. And again, this is another recreation of what the temple ended up looking like. He also built a number of forts. This is a particular fort called Masada. It's a very famous fort. And what you can see is it's in a perfect spot for a fort. It's high up. And the reason you build a fort high up is that so you can see your enemies all over. So he ended up building this too. You also have the remains of Herod's palace at Caesarea, which is a port city he ended up building. So you can see some pretty amazing archaeological finds there. And this is an overview of Herod's harbor at Caesarea. Now what you're looking at is this is part of the land that you can see. If you're flying overhead, this entire area is underwater. But it's clear where you can see where the boats came in, and then you've got a safe area to land your ships. And then what I have here is an image of a video I'd like you to watch. You won't be able to watch it directly off this particular video, but what I will do is put a tag on this particular image. And what I want you to do is to click on the tag and then watch the video. It should start playing right away. And what it is, it's a part of, I think it's National Geographic, about finding Herod's tomb, because it was lost for a very long time.